2 days before Christmas, my son called and said 8 words that ended 30 years of trying. Don't come up this year. Vanessa needs space. I sat in my kitchen in Calgary with the phone in my hand and a turkey already thawing in the sink. I had no idea that the worst Christmas Eve of my life was about to become the moment everything finally changed. My name is Robert Calloway, and I'm 63 years old. I'm telling you this from the other side of something I didn't think I'd survive. 5 years ago, I would have described myself as a man held together by hope. Hope that my son would one day let me back in. Hope that if I was patient enough, quiet enough, apologetic enough, things would go back to the way they were before the divorce. I was wrong about almost everything, but I was right about one thing. There were people out there worth holding on to. I just hadn't met them yet. I moved to Calgary from Ottawa 8 years ago, right after the marriage ended. 27 years with my wife, and then one Tuesday in February she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and told me she hadn't been happy in a long time. I didn't fight it. I think somewhere I already knew. We divided things carefully, quietly, with the kind of exhausted civility that comes after years of avoiding the real conversations. My daughter handled it the way she handled most difficult things, with grace and both arms open toward both of her parents. My son handled it differently. He handled it like I had chosen to leave him, not just the marriage. I took a retirement package from the school board where I'd spent 30 years as a principal and moved west. Calgary made sense. Cheaper than Vancouver, big enough to disappear into, close enough to mountains that I could feel like the geography was doing something for my soul. I found a condo in the northwest, near the river path. I built a small life. I walked every morning. I volunteered at the library 2 afternoons a week. I called my son on the first Sunday of every month, the way you keep watering a plant that isn't growing, out of habit more than hope. Most of those calls lasted less than 10 minutes. He was busy. Vanessa had plans. The kids had activities. There was always a reason the conversation couldn't go deeper than the surface. I stopped expecting warmth from those calls around year 3. By year 5, I'd started dreading them. But Christmas was different. Christmas I still believed in. Every December I bought a new ornament and mailed it to them, even though I knew my daughter-in-law thought it was sentimental and slightly embarrassing. I still sent the kids gift cards because I didn't know what they were interested in anymore, and I didn't want to get it wrong. And every year I asked, quietly, carefully, whether I might come for a few days over the holidays. Sometimes the answer was a vague, maybe that dissolved into logistics. Twice, I'd actually made it, slept on the pull-out sofa in their spare room in Mississauga, eaten Christmas dinner at a table where I felt like a guest who'd arrived unannounced. But I kept asking, because asking felt like the only thing I could still control. This particular December, I hadn't just asked. I'd already bought the flight, WestJet, direct from Calgary to Pearson, arriving the 23rd. I'd arranged for a neighbor to water my plant and collect my mail. I had a bag half-packed on the bedroom chair. And then the phone rang. My son's voice was not unkind, which almost made it worse. He wasn't angry. He was matter-of-fact. The way you are when you've already had the conversation with someone else and you're just delivering the conclusion. He said Vanessa was finding the holidays stressful this year. Her mother was staying with them, and adding more people to the house wasn't going to work. He said maybe next year. He said he was sorry, but not in a way that suggested he actually was. I didn't argue. That was the thing about 6 years of trying to hold this relationship together. I'd learned that arguing made things worse, and silence was safer, and there was nothing I could say that wouldn't be used as evidence of what was wrong with me. So I said I understood. I said I hoped they had a good Christmas. I said to give the kids a hug from me. And then I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the turkey in the sink. My daughter called 20 minutes later. She had a way of knowing. She lived in Victoria, and I could hear the ocean in the background of her voice. Or maybe that's just what I imagined because she always seemed calmer than the rest of us. She said she'd heard from her brother, and she was furious on my behalf. She said she wished she could fly me out to Victoria, but her apartment was tiny, and her partner's family was already coming, and she felt terrible. I told her not to. I meant it. She had her own life, and she'd never once made me feel unwanted in it. That was enough. After we hung up, I canceled the flight. The cancellation fee was $85. I stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the turkey, and then I put it in the freezer. Christmas Eve in Calgary is quiet in a particular way. The cold presses in from every direction, and the city goes still, and people disappear behind their doors into whatever warmth they've built for themselves. I didn't have anywhere to be. I'd bought food I didn't need and wrapped gifts that were still sitting under the small tree in my living room. Around 5 in the afternoon, I put on my coat, my good wool one, and decided I was not going to spend the evening alone in my condo feeling sorry for myself. I had limits. That was mine. There's a Tim Hortons near my building, but I drove a little farther that evening to a family restaurant I'd been to a few times, a Greek place on Crowchild Trail that stayed open through the holidays. It was warm and noisy in the right way, the way a space gets when it's full of people who are glad to be there. I sat at a table by the window and ordered the lamb and a glass of house red and watched the street outside. Families walking to their cars, a couple holding hands, a father carrying a small child in a snowsuit. I watched all of it, and I was careful about the feelings I allowed myself to have. I'd gotten good at that. I was halfway through dinner when someone knocked on the side of my table. I looked up. A woman was standing there, maybe 70, small and sharp-eyed, and wearing a Christmas sweater that had a moose on it with a red nose. She was smiling at me with the kind of directness that comes from a lifetime of not apologizing for her own presence. She said her name was Margaret, and she was eating with her husband and their son's family at the big table in the back, and she'd noticed me when I came in, and she didn't want to be presumptuous, but she thought no one should be eating alone on Christmas Eve. I started to say I was fine. She smiled like she'd already heard that answer and had decided it wasn't the right one. She said there was plenty of room, and her husband Frank had already said he'd be glad for the company, and their grandson was 3 years old and would almost certainly try to put something in my coat pocket. But other than that, they were a perfectly reasonable family. Then she stood there, completely unruffled, and waited for me to decide. I thought about my condo. I thought about the small tree and the wrapped gifts and the silent evening ahead. I put down my fork and picked up my glass and followed Margaret Okafor to the back of the restaurant. Frank stood up when I arrived, the way men of a certain generation do, and shook my hand with both of his. He had a broad face and gray at his temples, and the kind of steadiness that makes you trust someone before you know why. Their son David was there with his wife and the grandson, whose name was Oliver, and who did, in fact, within 4 minutes of meeting me, place a sugar packet in my breast pocket with enormous seriousness. Their daughter-in-law, Clara, laughed and apologized, and I told her it was the nicest gift I'd received all year. We ate for 2 hours. We talked about nothing and everything. Frank had retired from the Calgary Fire Department. Margaret had spent 30 years as a social worker. We discovered I had been a principal at a school 2 blocks from their old house in Killarney. We might have walked past each other 100 times without knowing it. That's the thing about cities. They're full of near misses. When the evening wound down and coats were being collected and Oliver was asleep on Clara's shoulder, Margaret pressed a piece of paper into my hand. It had their address on it and their phone number, and at the bottom, in careful letters, she'd written, "Sunday dinners. Every week. You're welcome whenever you're ready." I drove home through the lit-up streets of Calgary and sat in my parking garage for a while before going up. The paper was in my coat pocket next to the sugar packet. I kept them both. I went the following Sunday. Margaret opened the door before I rang the bell, as though she'd been watching. Frank was in the kitchen arguing cheerfully with David about the right way to make jerk chicken, which Frank had learned from his mother in Trinidad, and David had subsequently learned from YouTube, and they both believed their version was superior. Oliver was in the living room in pajamas, deeply focused on a wooden puzzle. Clara waved from the kitchen and handed me a beer. I stayed for 3 hours. When I left, Frank shook my hand at the door and said, "Same time next week? Not a question." I went back the next Sunday, and the one after that. Somewhere around the 6th week, I stopped thinking of it as visiting and started thinking of it as where I was going on Sundays. Margaret always asked about my week in a way that expected a real answer. Frank and I started walking together on Saturday mornings, along the river path, in the particular silence of men who don't need to fill every moment with words, but are glad not to be walking alone. David began texting me things he found funny. Oliver learned my name and used it constantly and without context, in the middle of meals, at random moments during the evening, as if confirming I was still there. By spring, I had a mug that lived in their cupboard. My rain jacket hung on the hook by the back door between Frank's fleece and Margaret's good coat. Clara had started saving newspaper clippings for me about things she thought I'd find interesting. I was part of the rhythm of that house. Not as a guest, not as charity, but as someone they decided mattered. That April, my son called. Not on the first Sunday of the month, on a Tuesday, which was unusual. His voice had a particular quality I recognized from when he was a teenager and had done something he needed to tell me about. He asked how I was, which took about 45 seconds. Then he moved to the real thing. He and Vanessa had found a house in Barrie. Not in Mississauga anymore. A detached, 4 bedrooms, good school district, proper yard for the kids. The market had been brutal, he said, as anyone who'd looked at Ontario real estate in the past decade could tell you, and they'd found something they could actually afford, but the numbers were tight. They had their 5%, but the stress test was making things harder than they'd expected, and Vanessa's parents had helped with what they could, and he was wondering. He wanted $60,000. Not a gift, he said. A loan. He'd pay it back. He said things like payment schedule, and I'll put it in writing. He said he knew it was a big ask, and he appreciated that I'd done well from my retirement package and the condo sale in Ottawa. I was sitting at my kitchen table. I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she'd once told me, during a Sunday dinner conversation that had somehow arrived there from a discussion about her work, that the most loving thing you could do for someone was refuse to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. She'd said it matter-of-factly, not as a lesson aimed at me, just as something she'd learned. But I'd kept it. I asked my son if he'd spoken to a mortgage broker about other options. I asked if he'd looked at the first home savings account. I asked if he'd considered a slightly smaller property or a different area. Each question landed like something he hadn't expected and didn't appreciate. He said they'd done their research. He said this was the right house for their family. He said he wouldn't be asking if he had another option. I told him I wasn't going to give him $60,000. The silence on his end was different from any silence I'd experienced with him before. Longer, more final. He said I had the money. He said I'd sold my Ottawa home. He said I was sitting on investments I didn't need. I said that those investments were the reason I could afford to live without working. And at 62 years old, I was not going to dismantle my financial security because he'd bought above his means in a hot market. I said I would be glad to sit down with him and a financial advisor and look at what options existed. He said that was condescending. I said I understood why I felt that way. Then he said something he'd never said directly before. He said the divorce had cost their family something, that his mother had struggled, that I had left and started over while everyone else dealt with the fallout, and the least I could do was be there when they actually needed me. I'd been waiting for that sentence for 6 years. Not because I wanted to hear it, because I knew it was underneath everything, every short phone call and declined invitation, every Christmas I wasn't welcome. I understood where it came from. I didn't agree with it, but I understood it. I told him I was sorry for the pain the divorce had caused him. I meant it. I said I was not sorry for leaving a marriage that had stopped working, and I was not willing to spend the rest of my life paying a debt I didn't believe I owed him. I said I loved him. I said I was not going to give him the money. He said fine. Then he said don't bother calling anymore. He said the kids didn't really know me anyway and it would be easier for everyone. He said he'd thought I might actually come through for once and he'd been wrong and that was the last time he was going to let himself be surprised by me. Then he hung up. I sat with the phone on the table and listened to my condo. The fridge hummed. A car passed on the street below. I thought about the turkey I'd put in the freezer at Christmas and whether I'd ever taken it back out. I thought about 30 years of teaching other people's children and trying to be present in the life of my own son and how little any of it seemed to have mattered. Then I called Frank. He picked up on the second ring and said, "Are you okay?" in that particular way that told me he already knew something had happened. I told him. He listened. When I finished, he said, "Come over." And I heard Margaret in the background asking who it was. And then he said, "Robert." And she said, "Well, tell him to come over." And that was the whole conversation. I sat at their table that night with a cup of Margaret's tea, and I said it all out loud. The money, the divorce, the years of short phone calls and canceled Christmases. The sentence my son had finally said directly that had always been underneath everything. I said I'd told him no. I said I thought I'd done the right thing, and I wasn't entirely certain I'd done the right thing, and I needed someone to help me stay clear. Margaret looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't refuse him because you don't love him. You refused him because loving someone doesn't mean subsidizing every decision they make at your own expense." She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without decoration. Frank nodded. He said the hardest thing about loving your children is accepting that you cannot save them from themselves. And the second hardest thing is accepting that sometimes they need to learn that you won't. I went home that night and didn't sleep much, but it was a clear kind of wakefulness, not grief, not doubt, just the particular alertness of someone who has finally stopped pretending a thing isn't what it is. My son didn't call again. Not that month, not the following month, not at Christmas, when I spent the holiday at the Okafor house and Margaret made red velvet cake, and Oliver tore through wrapping paper with the ferocity of someone who believed gift wrap was a personal enemy. Not the Christmas after that. Not for 3 years. I filled those years with things I hadn't let myself have before. I started a woodworking class at a community center in Brentwood. It turned out I was mediocre at it, but Frank was surprisingly good, and we started going together on Thursday nights, and I got less mediocre. I traveled twice, once to Nova Scotia with Frank and Margaret for their anniversary, which they insisted I join, and once to Portugal on my own, which I'd been thinking about for 20 years. I had dinner with my daughter every few months, flying to Victoria or her flying to Calgary, and those dinners were easy in the way only relationships built on genuine goodwill can be. I watched Oliver grow from a toddler into a small boy with opinions about hockey teams. I was there the night Frank went to the hospital with his heart, and I sat with Margaret in the waiting room for 4 hours until the doctor came out and said it had been a warning and not the worst thing. And when Frank came home 2 days later, I was at their door with groceries and a new puzzle for Oliver because I didn't know what else to do with the feeling that I was about to lose someone I couldn't afford to lose. Frank looked at me from his hospital bed that they'd set up in the living room temporarily and said, "You're a good man, Robert." And I said, "So are you." And that was all we said about it. My daughter called me one March evening, 3.5 years after my son had stopped speaking to me. She said she had news. She'd been accepted to a graduate program, a master's in environmental science at the University of British Columbia, and she was going to have a convocation ceremony in June, and she wanted me there. Then she said, "I need to tell you something else." She said she'd been in touch with her brother, not regularly, but occasionally, the way you maintain a thread, even when you're not sure what it's connecting. She said he'd been going through a hard time. The house in Barrie had ended up being more than they could manage long term, and they'd sold it at a loss 2 years earlier. He and Vanessa had separated over the winter, and the separation hadn't been kind. She said he'd asked about me. Not directly, but sideways. The way he asked about things he didn't know how to ask directly. She said she'd told him she was graduating and she wanted her family there. All of it. And she'd invited him. She said she understood if that was too much for me. And she said it was her day and her choice, and she wanted me to know before I arrived. I thought about Frank and Margaret in the waiting room of the Foothills Hospital. I thought about the moment Margaret had stood beside my restaurant table on Christmas Eve and refused to accept my automatic answer. I thought about Oliver's face when I'd taught him to use a handsaw in Frank's garage, concentrating with his whole small self on the thing he was learning. I thought about my daughter in Victoria, who had spent 4 years holding space for both sides of something that had never been her fault. I said I'd be there. I said she didn't need to worry about me. The ceremony was held on a Thursday morning in June at the UBC Chan Center, with a reception afterward in one of the campus gardens. My daughter glowed in her gown. When she crossed the stage and they announced her name, she looked out into the seats and found me, and I raised both hands and she laughed. The Okafors had come, all of them. Margaret and Frank had flown from Calgary, which I'd told them was completely unnecessary and they'd dismissed entirely. David and Clara were there. Oliver, now 6 and dressed in a button-up shirt he'd already untucked, was in the seat beside mine and fell asleep on Frank's arm during the 3rd hour of the ceremony. Margaret had spent the morning being charmed by my daughter, who had charmed everyone she'd ever met. And by lunch, the two of them were already making plans that didn't seem to involve consulting anyone else. I saw my son arrive during the reception. He came through the garden gate alone, which I hadn't expected. He was thinner than I remembered. He had the look of someone who'd been going through something they hadn't figured out how to set down yet. He found his sister immediately and held her for a long moment, and I watched my daughter reach up and press her hand to the back of his head the way she had when they were children, and he was the younger one. He looked up from that embrace and saw me. We stood there across the garden, maybe 20 feet apart. The noise of the reception filled the space between us. Margaret was somewhere to my left, talking to Clara. Frank was nearby. Oliver had found the dessert table and was engaging with it methodically. My son walked toward me. He stopped a few feet away, and I could see him searching for the right place to start. He'd always been better at anger than at the other things. He said, "I didn't know you had people." I said, "I have people." He looked at Frank, who happened to glance over at that moment and nod in the way Frank nodded at people, steadily, without judgment. He looked at Margaret, who was laughing at something Clara had said. He looked at Oliver, who was walking back from the dessert table with a piece of cake on a paper plate and absolute confidence in his direction. He said, "They're not family." I said gently, "They are." He was quiet for a moment. I didn't feel it. He said he'd lost the house. He said the separation had been his fault, mostly. He said things had been harder than he'd wanted to admit, and he'd spent the past year trying to understand some things about himself. He said it in a flat, careful voice, the voice of someone reporting facts rather than asking for something. I said I was sorry. I meant it. Not sorry in the way I'd been sorry for 30 years, apologizing for existing and for the divorce and for all the ways I'd fallen short of what he needed. Sorry in the way you're sorry when someone you love has been hurting. He looked at the garden, at the people moving through it. He said he'd thought I'd be smaller somehow, without them. I said I used to be. Oliver arrived then, slightly breathless, plate of cake held level with great care, and stopped directly between us. He looked up at my son with the frank assessment that 6-year-olds make of strangers. He said, "Are you Robert's son?" My son looked down at him. Something moved across his face that I couldn't entirely name. He said, "Yeah." Oliver considered this. Then he said, "Robert is our grandpa. He can also be yours if you want. We have enough," and walked away with his cake. My son stood very still for a moment. Then something in his jaw loosened, just slightly. He said, "He seems pretty sure of himself." I said, "That's Oliver." We stood there together for another minute, without saying anything. The late afternoon light was coming through the trees, and my daughter was somewhere behind us, laughing with Margaret. And Frank was walking toward us with 2 cups of coffee he'd found from somewhere, because that was what Frank did when he sensed a moment needed steadying. My son didn't stay long after that. He said goodbye to his sister and shook hands briefly with Frank and met Margaret's eyes for just a second. And Margaret, who had spent 30 years as a social worker and missed nothing, looked at him with something that was neither warmth nor coldness, but was entirely honest. He nodded at me at the gate. I nodded back. That was all. I didn't know what that was the beginning of. If anything, I wasn't counting on anything. I'd stopped counting on things years ago and found that my hands were much freer without the weight of what I was holding. What I knew was this. My daughter was a doctor of environmental science, and she was luminous with it. Margaret was already planning to take her on a hike the next morning. Frank had developed a friendship with David over the dessert table that would probably result in some project neither of their wives had been consulted on. Oliver had eaten more cake than was medically advisable and fallen asleep on the drive back to the hotel, serene and absolutely certain of his place in the world. That evening, after my daughter and her partner had headed home and the others had gone up to their rooms, Frank and I sat in the hotel lobby for a while. It was quiet. The city outside the windows was doing its evening thing. Frank said, "That took courage. What you did today." I said I wasn't sure I'd done anything. He said, "You stood in that garden and let your son see your life. That's not nothing." I thought about the Christmas Eve 6 years ago, when I'd sat in a restaurant in Calgary with nowhere to be, certain that I was too old and too far along in the wrong direction to find anything new. I thought about Margaret appearing beside my table with her moose sweater, and her refusal to take no for an answer. I thought about what I might have missed if I'd just eaten the lamb and driven home alone and accepted the shape of things as they were. There's something nobody tells you about getting older. They tell you about the losses. And there are losses. But they don't always tell you that somewhere in the middle of it, if you're paying attention, if you say yes to the right invitations, you can find out who you actually are. Not who you were trying to be for someone else's approval. Not who you'd shrunk yourself into to keep the peace. Who you are when someone sees you without conditions and decides you're worth showing up for. Frank and Margaret had done that for me. My daughter had done it her whole life, and I'd been too busy grieving my son to fully understand what I had in her. Oliver did it every single Sunday without thinking about it, just by putting a sugar packet in my pocket and saying my name like it was a thing worth saying. I don't know what my son is going to do with what he saw in that garden. That's not mine to know. I have stopped spending energy on questions that aren't mine to answer. What I know is that I drove back to Calgary 2 days later, with Frank asleep in the passenger seat and Margaret reading her book in the back and the mountains coming up on the left side of the highway, enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful. I know that the following Sunday there was dinner, the way there was, every Sunday, and there was Oliver's voice carrying from the kitchen, and there was the particular smell of whatever Frank had decided to cook. And there was Margaret looking up when I came through the door with the same expression she'd had the very first time, like my arriving was exactly what she'd been expecting. I know that family is not the thing you're born into, or the thing you spend 30 years trying to earn from someone who keeps moving the finish line. Family is the people who see you clearly and choose you anyway, every week, in every small, ordinary moment that adds up to a life. I know that I am 63 years old, and I have never felt more at home than I do in a house in northwest Calgary on a Sunday evening, with a cup of tea and an untucked 6-year-old and 2 people who decided, for no reason other than that they wanted to, that I was worth having around. That's the whole story. Or rather, it's the part I can tell you now. The rest is still happening, every week, one Sunday at a time.